Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Oraculos True Divination podcast, where I bring you ancient wisdom for the modern mystic. I'm your host, Mychal A. Bryan, and joining me today is my dear friend, Gary P. Caton. Gary, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Mychal. It's wonderful to be here. Yeah, thanks.
Most definitely, Gary. Now, Gary, you and I have a very fascinating topic that we're going to go into today, and it's really special to the two of us, and that is the topic of Mercury within the context of its relationship to both alchemy and astrology. So I can't wait to dive into that. But before we get into that, for those of you who are new to the Oraculos True Divination podcast, this is a podcast where I bring you interviews from astrologers from around the world who are doing amazing things within our field of astrology. And if that is interesting to you at all, then please feel free to not only like this YouTube channel, but also subscribe and share this podcast with your astrological buddies and your other colleagues so that we can circulate some of the magic and the momentum that we're generating here on the True Divination podcast. Now, Gary, you and we met at UAC. I came to your lecture on alchemy and astrology at UAC. And then, like a complete weirdo, when we were in the bathroom, I didn't come to you, but when we were in the bathroom, I saw you there and I started to talk to you about the lecture that you had just done. And we realized that we shared so much in common in terms of astrology, in terms of our relationship to Hermeticism and alchemy. And I just want to give you the opportunity, Gary, to tell our listeners and viewers a little bit about your own journey with astrology, how you came into astrology, and how you came to something so specific as a Hermetic approach to your astrology.
Wow, right on, man. Yeah. First of all, thank you for reaching out, even if it was in the bathroom. Sometimes that's just the way it rolls. That's where we ended up bumping together, and so be it. I'm really happy you reached out because, as you say, we have a lot to talk about. That a lot of that material is something that is maybe new for a lot of people who have only been doing astrology, but for you it was very familiar, and so it was nice to know that there are people out there, especially young people like yourself, who are tapped into the Hermetic currents and working it, man. So thank you for that, and thank you for reconnecting and inviting me here.
Thank you.
Yeah, I started out as an astrologer because of a dream that I had. I wasn't, I knew that astrology existed. I knew I was a sun sign Aries. That's about it. I knew that you could plant your garden by the moon, right? That's about it. My father used to plant, if we were planting potatoes, it's a root crop, right? You plant on a waning moon. Yeah, that's pretty basic stuff, man. And I was in school studying to be an architect, and I started having dreams of like animals speaking to me in English, right? And then I had this dream where I saw Venus, the symbol for Venus, the glyph for Venus, inside the heart of the sun, and it was so colorful and vivid, and I was like, wow, that is some kind of message, man. And so I started looking in books and trying to figure out what in the world could this mean, and I found an old Rosicrucian ephemeris. They're about this thick, it's blue, and I started flipping through it, and I managed to decipher how to read it. And I looked up the day where I had that dream. Venus was conjunct the sun, as it is now, by the way. We're recording the day before a Sun-Venus conjunction, right?
Wow.
And I was like, holy shit, that's like, what in the world? And I was hooked. So I spent hours and hours going through that ephemeris, and what about this and what about that? And I started buying all kinds of used books and trying to figure out how it was that this message came to me from, whatever you want to call it. the, you know, the Jungians might call it the collective unconscious, you know, Hermeticists would probably call it the world soul, or, you know, but something higher than me. And so, you know, being an Aquarius rising and being an Aries, I tend to be pretty independent, man. And I don't, it's hard for me to take advice, especially as a young man. So if it had come, if it had come from another human being, I probably wouldn't have paid it any mind. But when something comes like that, it's easier for me anyways to trust it, to just go with it and say, this is coming from some place magical and I'm just going to go with it, right? And so I had been doing the tarot, and then I started doing astrology, and as I got further along in my astrology studies, I started to realize, you know, that there's the magic connection and the alchemy. And I found out that really astrology as I knew it was being practiced in isolation, when in fact it had originally been practiced as one of three arts that were all related.
Yeah.
And when I learned that, I realized, like, I don't want to be 1/3 of something. I don't want to be 1/3 of a hermetic artist, right? I want to be all of it, man. And so I dove into the alchemy. I remember I made a spagyric tincture.
Wow.
I had a job writing horoscope columns, you know, at the time, and it can be tough. Sometimes it's just like that formulaic approach, you know. For me, it can be tough, and I would get writer's block sometimes. So I decided I was going to make a spagyric tincture to help with the writer's block. So I got some mullein. I found some mullein. It's an herb. Some people say it's Saturn. Other people say it's Mercury. I think it applies both. But I soaked it in some. I had some wild turkey, which is it's a bourbon, right? And I soaked it in the wild turkey for a while, and then I brought it out and I calcinated the remains, which means burned it.
Yeah.
And then so what happens is the alcohol extracts it pulls out the essential oil of the plant, and then the ashes contain the mineral salts. So what you're doing is you're dividing the plant into its three constituent parts, right? And the alchemical formula is solve, break apart, coagula, put back together. So you're purifying it down to its basic essence and putting it back together. Long story short, it did cure my writer's block. In fact, the next horoscopes I wrote were so good that my editor thought I wrote for the wrong month. She said, and I was like, what are you talking about? I'm Virgo moon. There's no way I wrote for the wrong month. Okay? Like, that's not going to happen, man.
Yeah.
On my worst day, like, and so it ended up, I lost the job.
Wow.
Didn't get renewed, and I thought, wow, did I screw up this tincture? Like, it was supposed to help me, and now I'm without a job. But I ended up getting another job that was even more suited to my to what I needed. So I got the income back, and next thing you know, I'm writing a book on Mercury. You know, and so I think that the lesson that I learned from that was, when you make, you know, like, so when you take a pill, like a drug, right? This is coming from a worldview of separation, that they don't acknowledge that spirit exists at all. There's only the material. And we just said, in alchemy, you can divide something up into its three parts. It's material constituent, the salt. It's the fiery driving force of that thing, its soul, and its consciousness, its spirit. You can work with any of those three parts. Well, in science, they say the other two don't exist. There is only the material aspect of something. And when you take a drug that's coming from that view, what you get is more you get more. It's already split. It's already only 1/3 of itself. And what do you get? You get all these side effects. You
Mm-hmm.
get, yeah, maybe it worked. Maybe they work for, but then what else? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But when you take something that is derived from a process of wholeness, you get more wholeness.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that was really enlightening for me. And so, I started to really dive into the alchemy and the magic after that even more.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that was kind of the inspiration for my book, is that I wanted to um, look at the Mercury cycle through the elements from point of view of a holistic approach. That is, where it's not just the astrology, but it's also the magic and the alchemy, and to bring those three together. And I know that's a passion that you share as well.
It definitely is, Gary. And I honestly believe that this holistic worldview that we find in alchemy of the sulfur, the mercury, and the salt is really something that transcends alchemy itself, and it goes into all spheres of our lives, because you find people who are just living from the salt material nature and they get stuck there. And then you find other people who are trying their hardest to live from the effervescent mercurial nature. But we can't really operate on that realm of existence if we don't have some sense of where we're grounded. And that's the salt principle. And then that sulfuric principle serves as the bridge between the two to allow there to be life and an organic sense of exchange between these various parts of ourselves, so that we don't get stuck in any one piece.
You get the starving artist who, like, they're really in touch with their spirit, but they can't make a living. Or you get the spiritual people who have no practical,
Yeah.
sense of, like, it could go both ways, right? So what
Yeah.
I was saying about the scientific approach is true the other way, right? Good
Yeah.
point. Yeah.
Yeah. And it brings me to a quote that I heard early on in life, where this person said that we mustn't be so heaven bound that we're of no earthly good.
Yes,
Uh,
sir.
and I think the alchemical worldview is one that demands of us that we integrate all of these parts of ourselves, and that we don't look at one part of ourselves as being more dignified than the other, because essentially we need all these three components, the component of body, of soul, and spirit, in order for us to do our great work here.
Beautiful. Couldn't have said it better, brother. Yeah, you're preaching to the choir. Amen. Hallelujah.
Yeah. Now, Gary, I do want to take a moment to talk about your book, and I also want you to talk about your publisher and tell us what that process was like, moving from being Gary, alchemist astrologer, to Gary, author, and how did your publisher help to facilitate that process?
So yeah, back in the winter of 2013, I started on this book, and it didn't get published until 2017. So it was a pretty long journey. Um, and at first, I really just wanted to make an ephemeris for myself, because what the insight that I had, which was crazy, I had a copy of in fact, I still have it right here on my desk. It's the Emerald Tablet,
Uh,
right?
yeah.
And so and I had been out, and by the way, for most people think it says as above, so below. It doesn't say that. What it says is um, that which is above corresponds to that which is below, and that which is below corresponds to that which is above,
Hmm.
to accomplish the miracles of the one. So there is a correspondence. There's a two-way conversation between the above and the below, like we were talking about before. Don't be
Hmm.
so heaven bound that you're of no earthly value.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I had been watching the astronomical movements of Mercury as a photographer. I was going out, and I was and as an astronomer, and I was really trying to more deeply understand that, and to communicate to that with people through a visual medium. And I realized, like, wait a second, this thing that I'm reading on here, this above, below, this is not just, in other words, I was heaven bound with it. I understood it as a concept. But it dawned on me, what if this is also salt? What if this is also actually the actual material reality of what Mercury does as a planet in the sky, as a visual phenomenon?
Mm-hmm.
I was like, and I knew it was true, bro. With the minute I had the idea, I knew it was true. I knew it. And I said, wow. And so I started looking, and what I found was that when Mercury is at what's called its maximum elongation from the sun, right? And that can be anywhere between 17 and 28 degrees,
right?
Depending on the cycle.
Mm-hmm.
That's as high as it gets in the sky. That's when you'll be able to see it. And then when it drops below the threshold of 15 degrees, it unites with the sun. It's invisible. It's below the horizon. And then it makes another elongation in the morning. And guess what? Those three things, the elongation in the evening, the invisible conjunction, and the elongation in the morning, they happen in the same degrees of the zodiac. Every single time, man.
Wow.
Oh my God, yes, yes.
Yeah, no.
I called my alchemy tutor, my friend, and I was like, oh, you won't believe it, man. and that's not it. That's not it. Not only is that true, that the above and the below are literally related,
mm-hmm.
salt-wise, not just spirit-wise, but it goes on to say in the Emerald Tablet, its father is the sun, its mother the moon, the wind carries it in its belly, its nurse is the earth.
Wow.
These refer to 4 alchemical operations, as you know.
Mm-hmm.
They also refer to the 4 elements, right?
Mm-hmm.
Father is the sun, fire, mother the moon, water, wind, air, and earth is earth.
Mm-hmm.
That is the exact order in which Mercury does these triple alignments, above, below, above. It goes through them in that order, which, by the way, is what? The reverse zodiacal order.
Wow.
So these 2 insights came to me, and the second one came to me while I was explaining the first one to my mentor.
Mm-hmm.
Within that conversation, and it just blew my mind, and I was like, I gotta do more with this. So first, I just wanted to create an ephemeris just so I could just track this, you know.
Yeah.
Because and so I created the ephemeris in the winter of 2013, and then in the process of like just sharing, I think I was sharing on Facebook about how, you know, it felt to be finally discovering something new as an astrologer, like, you know, and to know that, like, I'm not, you know, I found the frontier. Like, beyond here lies, you know, what do they say on the old maps? Beyond here lies serpents, you know. And for me as an Aries, that's the place I always wanted to be, man. And I was there, and I was just really happy about it. And I was just, you know, sharing that feeling, and somebody said something, and one thing led to another, and I ended up connecting with Aaron at Rubito. And you know, I didn't really know Aaron. I mean, he lives in New Zealand, right? But I could tell that he knew what the heck he was talking about, and I could tell that he was also, you know, the French philosopher that he's really into, Gebser.
Mm.
Yeah, I was like, wow, there's something pretty cool going on there. The ever-present origin, you know, that idea. And so I just went with it, man. And you know, the result was just so beautiful. I mean, he made such a beautiful book.
Absolutely stunning.
And it even feels good to the touch. And the print, you know, I can read it without my glasses, which is interesting. The print, the typeface, every single thing about it was just, I was so glad, because a lot of people, you know, so self-publishing is where it's at, and I just had a feeling like I think I'm a little bit, that's you know, it's a little bit above my head to do that. I know I can do the writing. Let someone else do that who really knows how to do it. And I'm really glad that I did, because he created an absolutely beautiful book. And it's a, you know, as you found out talking to him, it's a press that's dedicated to alchemical type treatises. So, and you know, I mean, geez, I'm published by the same press as Demetra George now. So,
yeah.
For those who don't know what I'm talking about, Erin also did her recent, you know, tome.
Wow.
This is amazing. I mean, it's really thick, but it's so incredible, you know.
Absolutely beautiful. Yeah. And last night I said to him, because he and I were speaking last night, and I said to him how amazing the book felt to touch. Like, I mean, without even getting into the body of the text itself, the touch of the book, I said, you know, this just feels like love. It just feels so good. And the entire presentation and the entire final result, absolutely stunning. So nothing but love for Aaron over there at Rubido Press.
Right on. Yeah, right on. Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you, Aaron. Okay, now, Gary, let's dial it in a bit, because I know that today we're specifically speaking about the role of Mercury and water within alchemical tradition, but also because of your unique perspective as being a Hermetic astrologer, we're also going to tie some astrology into that. So, Gary, talk to us a bit about why you think it's so important for us to, first of all, make this connection between Mercury and water, and what does that give us today from a philosophical level or a practical level as modern astrologers?
Right. Wonderful questions. So, just as a principle, as a sort of philosophical principle, and even as a physical element, Mercury is watery. It's flowing. It's constantly shifting and changing and flowing, right? So there's that, yeah. So, you know, for a long time in alchemy, you had mercury and sulfur, right? And this interchange between, and they change back and forth into each other, this constant cycle of the Ouroboros eating its tail and everything. And then Paracelsus came along and added salt to that, and what we were talking about before, where you have the three constituents of something. And really, you can also see Mercury as the, in those three, Mercury as the one that is the, you know, the sulfur is sort of yang, and the salt is kind of yin, and Mercury is the flowing, you know, thing that flows between them, that links them together, you know. And then in the sense of water as what most astrologers would understand as water, in terms of the element water, what we have this year is that Mercury will spend more time in the water signs. There's three of them, right? For the people who might be real beginners, yeah. There's three, they're called triplicities. There's three signs of each of the four elements, right? 3 times 12. Mercury will spend more time in those three signs alone than all the other ones combined.
Wow.
Yeah. So that right there is like, it's telling you, hey, pay attention to these signs, or pay attention to these houses, and you're right. Pay attention to this theme. This is a major thing going on, man. And so that's essentially where the power of the Mercury, what I call the Mercury elemental year, comes from. Is there's this, and it's not just that Mercury is going to be spending an extra amount of time there, but of course there's going to be this back and forth, this shaking and this stirring, and there's going to be, and he's going to be diving in between the earth and the sun, piercing this interior space of our system, right? And he's going to be going from above the horizon to below and above. So there's these, And if you know anything about water in terms of its nature in like the ocean or in a river, it's where two currents come together. That's where you find life. You get a cold current and a hot current, and they meet, and that's where all the fish, all the plankton, everything, it starts out as plankton, and then the little fish come and the big fish come and all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's this mixing of these currents that's happening in this particular element. This year it's water. As I said, there's a 7-year cycle where it goes from fire to water to air to earth, right? But for last year and this year, that is 2019 and 2020, it's the water signs. And so yeah, that's really why I want to talk about. That's one of the first reasons. There's another reason. There's always more that I want to talk about water. But water, as we said, if you think about water in terms of nature, it's really fascinating element. I mean, let's just talk about what it does. It always seeks the lowest place, right? The alchemical symbol for water is a downward pointing triangle. It always seeks the lowest place, and that's where the power of water in a river comes from. And the other thing is that it tends to pool in large bodies, right? The ocean. I mean, if you look at this planet from outer space, you look at Mars, it's red. This planet is blue. It's a watery planet, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and water is like, for that reason, like a very primordial element, right? That's where life comes from. Life comes from that meeting of the salt water and the fresh water, that place where those currents come together, and that's how life as we know it. So there's this really primordial nature to water too, and I think that's really where a lot of the alchemical importance of water comes from. Primordial nature.
This takes me back to something that I saw in Ptolemy once, because if we read the Tetrabiblos in describing the nature of the different planets because of their relationship to the luminaries, Ptolemy says that Mercury can be both wet and dry, separately and fully, basically. And Mercury is the only planet that he does that for. For all of the other planets, they have a defined characteristic. Saturn is cold and dry, but intemperately cold because of its distance from the sun. Mars is hot and dry, but intemperately hot because of its proximity to the sun. But when we come down to Mercury, he says, can be wet and dry, separately but fully. And he said that Mercury is wet because of its proximity to the Earth and because of the way in which it appropriates unto itself the moist vapors of the Earth. But it's dry because of the speed with which it moves. So when Mercury is wet, it's fully wet. And when Mercury is dry, it's fully dry. So this becomes a real point of magic in relation to our understanding of Mercury, because no other planet has the ability to balance inherently opposite characteristics of itself within itself. Mercury is the only one. And classically, even still looking at Ptolemy, classically, Mercury was treated as one of the primary pieces that we would analyze in understanding a natal horoscope. You would look at Mercury, and oddly enough, you look at the moon. So it was Mercury and the moon that you would look at classically. I mean, now today it's your sun sign and it's a lot of other things. But back then it was this Mercury and the moon that were the crux of life as we know it, which is essentially this ocean and this intelligence that you were just speaking about, that are the two real building blocks for understanding the soul of a person. So I just find that fascinating.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. Yeah, basically, when we talk about the qualities, right, you have hot and cold, and that's just about energy, right? Hot is very energetic, cold is a low energy state, and moist and dry, moist is like together, dry is separate, right? So when you combine these qualities, fire, for instance, is both hot and dry. That's very obvious.
Yeah.
And what happens when the sun comes up? The air gets hotter and it dries out. So the sun is fiery.
Mm-hmm.
Simple.
Yeah.
The moon is cool and moist. When the moon comes out, the air gets cooler and the dew falls on the grass. It's very obvious.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, all of the planets, Saturn is kind of cold and dry like Earth. Jupiter is warm and moist like airy, right?
Mm-hmm.
In other words, all of the planets have basically an element with which they naturally correspond. This is the source of the triplicity dignities,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, Mercury, total wild card. You can do it all, man. You know.
Absolutely.
So that's, I think, why the alchemists have always associated themselves with Mercury and Hermetic principles, because that ability to go wherever it's needed,
Mm-hmm.
wherever it needs to go, it can go. It's not sort of handicapped by a sort of primary nature that it can only do this. You know, it can go wherever it's needed. And that, of course, as an alchemist, that's the one you need, because you've got to be able to do all the various operations. You've got to be able to change. You know, sometimes there's a moist and a dry path in alchemy, right? There's two,
Mm-hmm.
and so on. So I think that what you hit on is really important to understand, that that's one of the reasons why that Mercury was always, you know, revered, and really found a central place in the Hermetic and paradigm. Like you say, modern astrology, they get all woo woo about the outer planets, but that's not the way it was back in classical times, man.
Yeah.
So that's a really good point. Yeah.
Yeah. I think this whole thing of Mercury being, in a sense, an arc of life, or Mercury being a carrier of the primordial life stuff that we need in order to facilitate life, is a very big piece in our classical approaches to alchemy, to magic, to astrology, because even Hermeticism is named after Mercury. He was Hermes Trismegistus because of how he appeared in these three cultures of ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and ancient Egypt. And it was
There's that three again.
Yeah, the whole concept of three. And it's this Mercury as being the god of speech, and speech being a vehicle of magic, and a vehicle of power, and a vehicle of intelligence and mathematics, and how these things are essentially the non-tangible building blocks for this tangible reality that we see. So
Yeah.
I think that we need to lift up Mercury again to his rightful place, to his or her, because Mercury is feminine with the feminine planets and masculine with the masculine planets.
Yeah.
So we
You
need
could say it's, but it feels neuter. I would
right.
like to prefer his or her. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
but in a way, we do need to lift up Mercury again to the forefront of our astrological thinking, because when we look in books like Guido Bonatti on natal astrology, he says that you look at the moon and you look at Mercury as being indications of the soul of the native, but then they drop it there. They don't actually go into the philosophical basis as to why Mercury is so important, or as to why the moon is so important. And this is a place where I think that the alchemists can come in and school us and
Yeah.
give us that ancient wisdom as to why we look at Mercury and the moon and water with such reverence.
Yes. Also in Hindu and Vedic astrology, in the Jyotish system,
Mm-hmm.
I talked with a good friend of mine, Ryan Kurzak. He used to be here in Asheville, in the Asheville area, and he said that the view is that it's like you said, Mercury is essentially the manager of the chart, like, because he has no set nature,
Mm-hmm.
and because he can go to the various. Saturn is earthy. Saturn's going to be like that. Jupiter's going to be basically opposite. Venus and Mars basically opposite. Sun and Moon basically opposite. So it's Mercury is the only one that can go and to manage these pairs of opposites, right? So it
Mm-hmm.
becomes a really central part of understanding the chart because of that, because he's sort of like the manager that, you know, brings all these pieces together. So no matter what you're doing, and that's, I think, why this whole, you know, hysteria that was cultivated, I think, I'm not sure why, but, you know, you would get the hysteria around Mercury retrograde. You know, it was kind of ridiculous, but I think it's also that, like, there's always a little bit of truth in something, or it wouldn't take off, right? And the truth is, we everywhere we go, there he is, she is,
Mm-hmm.
and that's why, you know, this phenomenon when Mercury goes retrograde, oh my God, what's going on? You know, because yeah, it's like walking around without your legs, or walking
Yeah.
around trying to lift something without your arms, or, you know. So yeah, and, you know, I mean, for the Persians, man, Hermes was an antediluvian prophet, like Moses or any of these other cats, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
wow, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, really a lot of reverence, you know.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's another thing that I think is really, you know, I've been giving lectures all around the country for about 10 years or so now, and that's another thing that I tried to really lay on people is like,
Mm-hmm.
this ain't just no little personal planet, you know, like there's this a big deal, man.
Yeah. Yeah.
Totally.
And the point that you made earlier about Mercury and the learning process, and how there's a wet path of alchemy as well as a dry path of alchemy. Learning itself takes place in that same way, because there is this wet, connective, almost devotional way in which you can learn something by being submerged in it and by learning through osmosis. And then there's also a very dry and a very practical and pragmatic and logical and sequential way of learning, which is not necessarily a devotional path, but it still has the same internal zeal, and it still has the same internal impetus. And I just think that it's so interesting how learning itself also takes on these two shapes that Mercury can take on, in being both wet and dry. And probably if we go down the rabbit hole of looking at all aspects of life, we can find that this concept of connection and separation exists everywhere, and that this is really this yin yang principle, this male female principle being balanced within the body of this one archetype that we call Mercury.
Yeah, wonderfully said. And unfortunately, we don't always find the balance that's in the archetype in the world, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
as you were pointing out those two kinds of learning, I mean, really, you know, academic learning is pretty freaking dry. I mean, that's the word that people use to describe academic text. It's awful dry, right?
Yeah.
And this devotional learning that you and I know by our own natures of diving
Mm-hmm.
into this stuff and being self-taught,
Mm-hmm.
autodidacts are often very devotional.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they learn because they love it, not because they've subscribed to some curriculum and yada yada yada, right?
Yeah.
So unfortunately, we don't always find the balance reflected in the world, but it doesn't mean that that the balance is not there. It just means that we're not living it.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, but, you know, another thing with the three, you know, the three Hermes, another thing that is reflected even within the astrology community, there are three eras or epochs of astrology, if you will, right? There's the pre-horoscopic epoch, which is, you know, Egyptian, Mesopotamian.
Mm-hmm.
It's visual, it's star-based, and this is a really huge part of who we are that often gets kind of dissed. You know, you say, oh, that's pre-horoscopic. It's not even really part of who we are because it's not based in this round chart wheel.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, my God, no, don't not circumcise me, man. You know? Sorry for the graphic, but
That's fine.
it feels that way.
Yeah.
Don't cut off part of who I am.
Yeah.
And then we have, then from there, of course, as you say, the Greeks got hold of the Egyptian and Mesopotamian ideas. You know, by that time we had ephemerides, and the Greeks made it their own, you know, but it was very syncretic.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, you know, that's obvious in things like the Dendera zodiac.
Mm-hmm.
So then we have this classic era where it's horoscopic, it's round chart wheel based. And that includes both the Hellenistic era and the medieval era up until, you know, around Lily.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have the modern era through which we get, you know, wonderful things like midpoints. There's a lot of wonderful things that I like about modern astrology.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know, psychological stuff is important, you know. It's important to know how to speak to someone about emotions, about,
Yeah.
And so I think that the other thing that I'm, as a Hermeticist, just like I want to be a whole Hermeticist, I want to be an alchemist, and really, alchemy, in my view, might be best coming first, because alchemy is a process of purification. And if you're purified first, then you're fit to read see, for an alchemist, for a hermeticist, the reading the chart, you're reading thoughts in the mind of God, or the one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Are you really fit to do that if you haven't been purified? You know,
Precisely. Uh-huh.
and then from there, you can, if you have some idea of what God is thinking or what God wants, or the way the cosmic winds are blowing in a more modern, then maybe you can do some magic to align with that and bring that energy into reality, right? So there's three parts to that. But it's the same way for me with, I don't want to say I'm a classical astrologer, or what they call, for me, the traditional would be the pre-horoscopic.
Yeah.
And I call the middle classic, and I call the other modern. I don't want to cut off one part of me. I want to be whole, man.
Yeah.
So I find also that, you know, this threeness is so, it's so a part of who we are.
Yeah.
And yeah, so these, so to steer back to the to this water thing, this idea that you brought up, which is wonderful, about a devotional way of learning. So yeah, that's what I discovered through this, through taking this elixir. That's what I discovered through alchemy and magic, and eventually magic. Was, I mean, I was devoted, obviously, when I had that dream. I mean, it pretty much just blew me away. And I was devotional without realizing I was devotional. But to really dive into it and say, I love you, baby, I want to know you completely. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I want to just melt and become one with you.
Mm-hmm.
That's a whole nother ball of wax, right? And
Yeah.
that's watery idea of merging, going back to the original oneness. Yeah.
You know, as I sit and listen to you, Gary, and as I reflect on especially that piece that you made, or especially that point that you made about the threeness of things, that just completely hit me in the jugular because that is exactly what it's about. Because as we look at our alchemical texts, what we see is that Mercury is born of male and female, but Mercury is neither male nor female. So Mercury is the third thing that is born out of the two things. And
1 + 1 = 3.
one, right, exactly. Mercury is the joining of sun and the joining of moon, which is the creation of Mercury. And in the body of Mercury, you can't pull out those aspects of it that are lunar, and you can't pull out those aspects of it that are solar, in the same way as a butterfly is a completely different entity than the caterpillar that came before it. Mercury challenges us to also accept this wider perspective of ourselves. And when it comes to our astrology, because I heard you mentioning these three epochs of astrology, when it comes to the way in which we approach astrology, we have the tendency sometimes to get caught in one particular part of our astrological tradition or another particular part of our astrological tradition, when in fact, if we take these two pieces, and if we call them the pre-horoscopic and then the horoscopic, and then our 21st century approaches to astrology, what we find is that at the 21st century, we are most poised to do that work of integration that is mercurial, that is neither pre-horoscopic or horoscopic, but we are poised to do something with our astrology that has never been done before. We're poised.
Amen and hallelujah, brother. Preach it. Preach.
Yeah. So I don't think that it's necessary for us to cut off any part. Well, let me stick a pin. There are many things in astrology that we know, especially because of the proliferation of astrology in the 21st century. There's a lot out there that doesn't have the same weight or heaviness as things that we can trace back to antiquity. But there are also so many amazing things that this modern world has given to our astrology that is within the spirit of Mercury, that calls us to charge boldly forward into the unknown. And I think that that process that we're on and that path of integration that we find ourselves faced with is one that calls on all of us to become Mercury, in a sense.
Yes, sir. You got it. I couldn't. That is probably a statement that I couldn't agree. Not only can I not agree with more, but it's probably the statement I agree with most of any I've heard in a very long time. So, yes, yes, indeed. To become, to embrace our threeness in so many ways, and to become, to take these two things and to become that third magical thing.
Mm-hmm.
Oh man, that's it. That's it. That's where the devotion comes in, because that's a hard journey.
Yeah.
You have to have that devotion. You have to have that love. You have to have that like absolute attachment to this. I'm all in, man.
Mm-hmm.
I'm all in. This is who I am. This is not something I do. This is not a job. This is not, and that for me, and then it's just who I am anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It's everything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And as I listen to this, I am thinking about so many parts of comparative philosophy and comparative religion, because when we step into mercurial waters, we don't just stay moving down one path. We bring in everything we know, because it is the nature of Mercury to be a lightning rod, in a sense, to bring together the pieces of everything that we know into one unified whole. So as I think, I'm remembering that within the Vedic tradition, there are three branches of yoga. And one branch is called Bhakti Yoga, which is the yoga of devotion. And then the other branch is called Jnana Yoga, which is the yoga of knowledge. So the path of the erudite scholar. And then the third part of yoga, or the third path of yoga, is the path of Karma Yoga, which is the yoga of just selfless service, basically. And I think that when we look at our own development as astrologers and as hermeticists, and as any path of mystical self development that we might find ourselves on, we are essentially doing these three things. We go into it as a devotee, and then we put around it, we wrap it in the cloth and the armor of our study and our relentless, tireless study. Because, I mean, you could be as devotional as you want, but this path also requires study, unbelievable amounts of study. I mean, between the two of us, we probably have 3 PhDs, how much study we've had to do to just be a devotee of this path. And then after that, we have to give it back to the world. And
You got
that
it.
is also a mercurial process.
Yes, sir. You got it. I love it, man. I love it. It seems especially important to talk about right now because let me be clear. I mean, for instance, I mean, you don't have all this silver stuff on your face like I do.
I have a couple. I mean, they're over here. So
Yeah, yeah, you might you starting to get some of that stuff
just a
too,
little
huh?
bit.
But I find it absolutely refreshing that there's new faces and new voices, and that astrology is having a moment of expansion. Let me just be clear about that. I welcome it wholeheartedly,
Mhm.
But at the same time, there's how do I say this? There's people that have been in the field for less than a decade, and they're catapulting into very high visibility very quickly, and it's like careful, easy, like it's a long process, and it like you said, it's really about bringing those three things together. And so you know um, I really hope that what you've just said can be taken to heart, especially um, in that sense of like that it's a long road, and that it requires all of us.
Mhm.
Yeah. So
Mhm. Well, Gary, on that point of less than a decade, I feel like I've only just hit the mark because I've been practicing astrology for 15 years. So I'm only just out of that barrel. But
half
I,
a Saturn cycle.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
But I completely agree with you in terms of people who haven't had the ability to grow roots in astrology being put in the most prominent places and becoming essentially the people who represent our field. And it's a bit challenging because the mercurial process is a precarious one. And yes, Mercury is a god of integration because he has to gather the information from Earth and gather the information from heaven and make sure that it gets distributed appropriately. But Mercury is also Loki. Mercury is also a trickster god. And so the same God that gathers information is that exact same God that has the ability to throw up these blinds around information and to scatter information in such a way whereas it doesn't become perceptible or understandable to the true seeker. And when we look into our traditional alchemical texts as well, some of them they speak very straightforward because they want to give you all the secret, and others of them they throw up all of these devices and all of these trapdoors so that you read a whole book and at the end of the book you're not even sure if you read the book at all. And and so it requires wisdom, I think, to deal and delve in mercurial waters because there's a quote, and I can't remember who it comes from. I think it comes from Kunrath or one of our traditional alchemists, where he says, beware of the gold makers. Beware of the people who come into alchemy thinking that it's somehow about turning rocks into gold. And
Mhm.
what we find today in our astrology is that there's a lot of people who are speaking and shouting from the mountaintops about turning rocks into gold.
Mm.
When the people who actually do have the knowledge and the people who actually have done the footwork and the people who have actually been in the trenches and done the work day in and day out in the trenches to develop a powerful body of work, they're not the ones who are out there preaching from the mountaintops. They're the ones silently working away in their labs. So I think that the world in general, and especially this new generation of astrologers coming in, has to beware of the gold makers and has to really search beneath the blinds and the disguises and all of the fluff out there and really search for the heart of a truly workable embodied version of astrology, or else we risk losing something that's really vital and really beautiful and really meaningful to all of us.
Mm. Well said, man. Well said. Yeah. Yeah, they called them puffers too, right? Because they were just puffing. You had this bellows, right? You had the
Yeah.
bellows to run the furnace. They were just puffing away. In other words, goes back to that thing where they fell into the trap of the materialistic thing being the only thing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that trap, that materialism trap, man, it's really a big one in our world. You know, the number of followers defines your value, for instance.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's great to have followers. I love my followers.
Mm-hmm.
I do. But, you know, if we start defining our worth through that, or defining the worth of our work that way, there's a lot of people out there with some really great work who don't have any followers because, you know, they're just before that technological curve where they, you know, grew up with this stuff. And it's just like, you know, so yeah, that's a really good point, man. I appreciate you making it because it sounds a lot more, you know, I think it sounds better coming from you because for a lot of reasons. So thank you.
Gary, I know that you prepared for us a slide today to show us where we are actually right now in terms of this Mercury cycle that you've spoken of. Can you share that with our viewers?
You bet. Be honored to.
Awesome.
So this is what I was talking about earlier. In the winter of 2013, I created an ephemeris so that I could track these above, below, above movements. As I said, this maximum elongation as evening star, the invisible conjunction, and the maximum elongation as morning star, they happen in the same degrees every single time.
Wow.
But the degrees themselves move through the zodiac, and they move through the zodiac in order of the elements, as we said, right? Fire, water, air, earth. So this particular one shows us, and what happens is you get between 4 and 6 conjunctions fall in one element, and then it moves to the next element. Okay? And so this visual is showing us that there are 6 of these triple alignments that happen in the water signs before we move into air. And so there was 3 of them last year and in 2019, and also 3 of them this year. And if we look at the one where we are currently, today is June 1st, Mercury's maximum elongation is on June the 4th. So we're already coming just about to that above place where it starts to speak to the below, where this correspondence between above and below begins to happen, where it's entering into degrees where it's going to cross 3 times, right? And this conversation between the macrocosm and the microcosm, and the above and the below, and the interior and the exterior, all of that is happening. And we can see here that it's actually also in the degrees of the star known as Alhina, which is the heel of the mortal twin. This is a very interesting mythology in and of itself. And we don't necessarily have to get into it, but you can look into it if you like.
Yeah.
And these degrees are between 9, 10, and 11 of Cancer, where these 3 alignments of Mercury with the Sun will happen. 1, the elongation in the evening. 2, the conjunction with the Sun. And 3, the elongation in the morning, right? So I talk about in my book how we can view this, that a healthier, yes, I believe healthier, but also just simply more productive way of viewing the Mercury retrograde process, rather than being, you know, hysterical about it and saying, don't do anything for, you know, 3 weeks or even more if you go with this whole shadow stuff.
Yeah.
Which I think is nonsense, by the way. But,
I've had quite a few people cancel interviews with me and other things because of Mercury retrograde. They were like, nope, let's wait until it's over.
Oh my God, man. Dude, I went out on lecture tour. I was driving around the country giving lectures during Mercury retrograde. Yeah, I missed a few turns, right? But come on. What are you going to stop living your life? I mean, man, I could go. I mean, I could just get up on that soapbox. I'm not going to do that.
Next time.
We could definitely do that. I spent a lot of. I've definitely done that. But yeah, this idea of the three parts in alchemy, we also talk about this transformation happening in three stages. You have the blackening, the whitening, and the reddening, right? Nigredo, albedo, rubedo.
Mm-hmm.
And so I propose that if you want to experience the Mercury retrograde in a healthier, more productive way, you could think about these periods in that terms of the blackening, the whitening, and the reddening. And specifically, what that means is the blackening is essentially dry in a sense that its putrefaction is actually moist in the sense of something is decaying, but it's dry in the sense of like that thing is not available to you anymore.
It's dying.
Yeah. So you could try fasting, and I don't necessarily mean literally stopping eating because that could be dangerous if your health is not in the right place for that. But you can fast, for instance, from words, certain words. I'm not going to use that word. But fasting, right? Honoring that it's natural for things to not always be there.
Yeah.
And this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Honoring that it's natural that there's a birth, a fullness, and an ending every year in the vegetative cycle of the year. Just honoring that process, and honoring that endings are natural and beautiful and good, and then by doing that, what we do is we create space in our life, right? If you stop doing something, or if you stop, it's like nature abhors a vacuum, is what they say, right?
Yeah.
And by creating that space, we're creating an opening, and the albedo is the light of spirit. Enters in, it pierces, it suddenly just shoots into, that part in the Corpus Hermeticum where they talk about the poemandries, where they talk about the darkness and the light, and the darkness called out to the light, and the light, I find that so beautiful, man.
And the darkness wrapped around the light.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And embraced. Yeah. It's so beautiful,
It
man.
is.
There's a penetrating quality, like the yang, light comes in, and it, it's like my dream. Like that was me being penetrated by something cosmic, man. That was the albedo. That was like boom, this burst of light that illuminated my psyche was something I hadn't even conceived of before. And this is more available around the conjunction, and then the rubedo would be okay. You have to take that light, you have to take that new energy, and you have to make it real. You have to. Rubedo means reddening, which is literally like, after you get a cut or something and the scab falls off, it's kind of white, and then eventually the blood flows back in there, it becomes red, right? So there's this reddening, the blood, sweat, and tears that it takes to make something real. I just thought, let's give, it's like they say about The Secret, The Secret.
Yeah.
Focus on what you want, right? And that, because it's rather than getting up on my soapbox and saying, don't have Mercury retrograde hysteria. Like, okay, but what do you want? Well, I thought this was a much better way of like doing it. So try this one instead.
Exactly.
And so that's what this is.
And Gary, what I think is really important for people to get from that story of the great poemandries is that this light comes down into materiality, and materiality wraps itself around that light and makes it functional within the world. And we have to remember that our job isn't just to focus on the light someplace as this disembodied force outside of us. Our job is to bring that light within ourselves, to call out that light and hug that light within our own material nature and allow that light to enliven us beyond just being a raw, crude bag of flesh and sinews, and to actually allow us to use this body to assist us in the fulfillment of our great work here on earth.
Beautiful, beautiful. Love it, man. Yeah, to become more, to embody consciousness, right?
Yeah.
It's embodied consciousness.
Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah. And so, yeah, I just thought that, this was a model that was, at least worth a try. And a lot of people have told me they find it very rewarding, so we have these three periods, in any given Mercury retrograde, we have these three periods of the Negredo, the Albedo, and the Rubedo. And then we have 3 repetitions of those 3 periods each year, right? So there's the threeness again. And then you'll notice that this only goes through the end of 2020, because next year we'll begin the air element. And so you'll have to have me back on to talk about that.
Definitely, Gary. Most assuredly.
You like the way I just invite myself back?
Please, always, always. Now, Gary, I do indeed find this to be a fascinating way of living with the Mercury cycle, because it gives us, as whether we're astrologers or whether we're just astrologically minded, it gives us a platform by which we can live our lives in harmony with these greater cosmic cycles. And whereas the original way that we live with Mercury retrograde is somehow based on hype and hysteria, this actually gives us a wholesome, devotional almost way of assessing where we are within the context of this greater cycle and adapting our own lives as our ancestors have done so before us to live in harmony with that which is going on within the cosmos. And a lot of us do it already with the moon. We tend to live by the waxing and the waning of the moon. And the same thing applies here. So I'm definitely going to apply this to my life, because just hearing you talk about it makes me feel like a more embodied astrologer. So thank you.
Oh, man. Thank you. Yeah. So, yeah, just the book is Hermetica Triptycha. This is volume 1. There's 3, of course. And I even went through, and at the end of each chapter, there's a Negredo, Albedo, Rubedo. At the end of each chapter, I have exercises for people. When it's the time of the Albedo, try this, try a vision quest. And so I gave them. There's a wonderful tradition that Demetra turned me on to, where they would go to a place that's sacred to Mercury, and they would go and they would stop up their ears, and they would first say their prayer or ask their question or whatever, and then they would stop up their ears, and as they leave the square or wherever it was, the first thing they hear is the answer to their question.
Wow.
And then you have to be, yes, talk about surrender.
Far out.
Yeah, and you can take that in a whole another place by making the entire thing a vision quest, right? And then you can interpret it as if it were a dream, So there's some wonderful exercises in here too for people to play around with, and I feel like that becoming actively engaged with it, experientially, experiential learning is what we're talking about. Yeah.
Gary, thank you so much for sharing that really rich and embodied approach to viewing the Mercury cycle, because honestly, up until today, I hadn't heard anybody else speaking about the Mercury cycle in that way. And in the 21st century, we tend to view the retrograde periods of Mercury as being this catastrophic thing. It's like the burning of Wall Street all over again, when in fact, what you laid out was this really embodied and even deeply spiritual way of living with our astrology. And I mean, we both know that astrology isn't a belief system per se, and it's not a religion or anything, but I think that for lots of us who are practicing astrologers, it does really take the place or fill a space of religion within our lives. And so to have something to do during these Mercury retrograde periods that feels more soulful and that feels more spiritual, I think is really important in terms of us becoming more integrated with the cosmos.
Right on. Yeah, I couldn't. Yeah, you got it. You said it perfectly.
Yeah.
Thank you
So
for seeing that. Yeah.
yeah. So thank you for that, Gary.
You're welcome.
Now, we have another big cosmic thing that people are talking about this year, and it is the Jupiter Saturn cycle and the Jupiter Saturn conjunction. And I know that you, Gary, have some very specific thoughts about the Jupiter Saturn cycle and conjunction. Can you tell us how do you feel about Jupiter Saturn as planets, and how do you feel about them coming together and what that represents?
Yeah, I have Jupiter, Saturn in my chart. They're both in aspect to my sun,
Mm,
so it's hard to really, I've really begun to appreciate Saturn the older I get. I think that's natural. Yeah. Um, that the toughness and the ability to stay with something, and the rewards that come just from showing up and not quitting. That's a very Saturn lesson, like sticking it out, man.
yeah.
For instance, I've been podcasting since 2008, and there's a big phenomenon. It's called pod fade. It's a real thing. Like people, it's hard to keep it up.
Yeah.
And I just had, like my biggest month ever, like in terms of downloads or whatever. So it's like that's a Saturn thing. Like you stick with it and you get the best rewards from the toughest planet, man. It's like it's a really steep curve, but if you stick with it at the end, it really gives the rewards. Um, it's easy to
Yep.
love Jupiter because Jupiter's like, here, you're just starting out, but what the heck? I'll give you this whole, I've had people give me, sections of their library. I remember when I was a young
Wow.
astrologer and like, that kind of thing. And that's, it's hard not to love that, right? Because it's just like,
Hmm.
boom, it's just like, here you go. But
Hmm.
I've definitely grown in my appreciation for Saturn too.
Yep.
Um, and so this, as we said earlier, they're very opposite principles, right? Saturn is cold and dry, Jupiter is warm and moist, and so when they come together in the sky, this is a big deal because, as the alchemists always talked about, the fixed and the volatile, and the merging of
Hmm.
those two is very magical.
Hmm.
And so, they've ever since the Persian era with cats like Abu Masar and Mychal, this has been a very important thing to track these Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions. And what we find out from them is that they happen in elements also, like we were talking about the Mercury retrogrades. They happen for about 200 years in one element, and they've been happening for a very long time in Earth, right?
Yeah.
And then in 1980, that cycle got broken. There was a conjunction in Libra. And then, look what happened in the cycle between 1980 and 2000, the birth of the internet, right?
Yeah.
Wow,
Yeah.
it's changed everything. But then in 2000, we went back to the earth. And then you had the monetization of the internet, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But with this one that's happening at the end of the year in Aquarius, we're going back into air and it's going to stay there. There's no going back to earth, right? And this is a really big deal because not only is it, a beginning of a new, more than 100 years of conjunctions happening in the air signs, but the nature of Earth and air are very much like the nature of Saturn and Jupiter. That is, they are opposite, right? Cold and dry, warm and moist. There's no similarity. With other elements like earth and fire, for instance, earth is cool and dry. Fire is hot and dry. So to get from earth to fire, what do? You rub two sticks together, right? Earth. Rub them together. You replace the cold with the heat, and poof, you get fire. Magic.
Mm-hmm.
With water to air, right? Again, you just add heat to water and vapor.
Right.
That's a relatively, but to get from earth to air, it takes 2 steps.
Yeah.
There's a tool that we have in alchemy called the square of opposites. So you can see here the combination of the qualities that makes up the elements, right? Mm-hmm. Water is cool and moist. Air is moist, becoming hot. Fire is hot, becoming dry. And earth is dry, becoming cool. Mm-hmm. So we can even see this in terms of the seasonal cycles through Aristotle, right? And as I said, when you get these elements that don't share a quality, so for earth to become fiery, we just replace the cold with the hot, and poof, we get fire. Right. But we don't have that luxury with earth and air. So there's this sort of, it takes 2 transformations to make one, essentially. Mm-hmm. And how do we do that? Well, earth can become fire, and then so it can become more warm, and then it would also become more from being hot and dry, it would become moist, hot and moist, and become air. Or it can become, it's cool and dry, it can become moist, become like water, and then it could become hot to become like air.
Right.
You see, so there's basically 2 paths. And this is interesting because we talked earlier about the wet and the dry path in alchemy. This is the same principle. There's a fiery path and there's a watery path to achieve this transformation from earth to air. And what's really fascinating about this, Mychal, I think I shared this with you once before. Mm-hmm. The last time we had the Jupiter-Saturn cycles moving from earth to air was when the cathedral in Notre Dame was built.
Yeah.
And we come around to the same one. And what is the Cathedral of Notre Dame? It's this blocks, this earth becoming air, this soaring cathedral, and it's through these flying buttresses, right? Mm-hmm. The cycle comes around again, and what happens? It burns down, man.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then, in alchemy, that burning is what we call calcination. It's a form of purification, like phoenix, right? It's a purifying fire so that it can be reborn. Well, the other way that you can purify something, of course, is to dunk it in the water.
Yeah.
So you have what's called dissolution. And the dissolution, this is sort of like the Christian baptism. There's this dissolving of the ego. And this devotion, like now I'm going to be a devotee of Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. And I mean, not very many people would put it that way. Not very many Christians. Well, they do. Maybe they would. They just wouldn't use the word devotion, right?
Yeah.
But the point is that there's sort of these 2 paths. And think about this: for water is down and in. What have we been doing since the COVID thing came in? Down and in. Stay at home. Mm-hmm. Stay at home, right? And then all of a sudden, they ease up the restrictions, and people start going out. And the next thing you know, there's this, the police are killing black people again, and everybody gets pissed off. And now the place is on fire, man. There's riots, and the place is burning. So you can see right away there's this watery path and this fiery path, and they're both perfectly valid.
Yeah.
And but they're also very different. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It might be that we need to be able to go both ways in order to really make this transition work. But with Mercury being in the water signs this year, it definitely puts a sort of emphasis on that. Don't forget, if you go the fire path, if you want to go out there and demonstrate, that's a very valid thing to do, and it's a very necessary thing to do. But don't forget also that there's the water path, right?
Mm-hmm.
This path of devotion, this path of submerging yourself, of sort of dissolving the ego and allowing, again, in Jungian terms, it would be the collective unconscious, right? Allowing these sort of watery images to soak into your, one of the main things that we do in alchemy, right? You would take an herb, or like yesterday, I was out gathering mushrooms, reishi mushrooms from the forest, and you would take those and you put them in a jar, and you would put spirits, you would put alcohol to dissolve, and it would literally pull out the minerals and the medicinal properties of the mushroom. It dissolves it and pulls it out into the tincture, so that they become more available, more concentrated, right? It's sort of like getting a straight shot of the medicinal stuff. Whereas if you ate it, right, your body would have to do the digesting and all that. It's as if the alcohol is digesting, it's pre-digesting the mushroom for you. So then when you take the drop of that tincture, you're getting the straight,
Yeah.
So there's this dissolution process that's available to us in addition to this calcination process. And like I said, you might find yourself in either one at any given moment.
Mm-hmm.
But the dissolution process, I think, in general, people are more familiar in the West, I think, with the yang elements, fire and air, water, this idea, for instance, one of the bestest books I ever read on astrology is not an astrology book at all. It's called let's see, what is it called? It's by Carol Pearson, and it's about the archetype of the hero. And she talks about how there's like four different ways of being a hero. There's the warrior, which might be like fire, right? But she said, hey, look, being a mother is also like caring for somebody, right? Devotional. That's also very heroic. And it's like, duh, hello, right?
Yeah.
So this, because what happens is, like for instance, I'm not a parent, but I do have pets. I have cats. And, you can get into these ego battles even with an animal, right? Where it's like, no, you're going to do it my way, you little, and they're like, no, you're going to do it my way, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I find myself just saying, I'm not going to fight with this little being, he's getting older anyways.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just going to just give him what he wants because, I'm like just surrendering my, like, because you can get into this place like, who's in charge here? Damn it, I'm the human. You're the, you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
That's surrender,
Mm-hmm.
and that is part of the devotional path. That's what I think water is about. It's about surrender, and it's about letting something wash over you, and in that process, you become essentially like that mushroom where the element, the stuff gets leached out of it, like these impurities get washed away from you,
Mm-hmm.
and you become more clean, more clear, more pure, more caring, more loving. And this is a beautiful thing, and so this is what's available. This emphasis of Mercury being in Cancer for so long.
Mm-hmm.
It gives us that ability to really focus on the watery path of living the watery path. And in the process, we're also going to be navigating this larger transition between the Jupiter Saturn, which is really cool, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gary, I find it really important, this point that you're making about us needing to do preparatory work, essentially, before we dive into the greater work that's before us as alchemists, as astrologers. No matter what your mystical inclination is, it requires us to become a different sort of person. And this is why these traditions in the past were always initiatic traditions. You didn't just pick up a book and then hang out your shingle. Oh, I am an alchemist or I am an astrologer. But you had to do deep preparatory work on yourself that required very mundane activities that you did each and every day, day in and day out, because you were preparing your vessel to be able to handle something much greater. And this goes back to something that is a part of yoga tradition, that the physical postures that we do in yoga, though they might seem mundane to a person who is primarily wanting to meditate or wanting to focus on more spiritual pursuits, those physical practices that we do, they're set in place to prepare the vehicle of our bodies in order to do something that is non-tangible. And it doesn't just prepare our bodies, but it also prepares our minds, it prepares our hearts, it prepares our souls, and it essentially makes us more receptive. And so, all of the things that are set before us to do in terms of us preparing ourselves to really do the work on us before we can help other people, it becomes a really important piece. And I hope that more people take time to not just practice their practice on others, but really practice their practice on themselves so that we can become better representations of our craft, our astrology, our alchemy, our everything, because
Human beings.
we're human beings. So, Gary, from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for your sharing today.
You're welcome, brother.
All right, Gary, now before we head out, please tell people where they can find you online. Please tell people about your podcast. Please tell people where they can find your book. Give us all the information so that we can become a part of your magic.
Right on, brother. So yeah, my website is dream, like what you do at night, dreamastrologer.com, because of my dream. and you can find my podcast is Hermetic Astrology Podcast. You can find that on all the major platforms, iTunes and Stitcher and all those various things. You can download that. There's also a page for that on Facebook for Hermetic Astrology Podcast. I have my own personal Facebook page as well. I'm happy to connect with people. I've also brought the podcast to YouTube as well. So if you would probably be better off searching my name, Gary P. Caton, on YouTube to find that. What else? Oh, with the book, it's by Revito Press, Hermetica Triptycha. So you can find that at the Revito Press website. It's there's Revito Press on the back.
Mm-hmm.
It's on Amazon as well, if that's the way you shop. And if you would like a signed copy, of course, you need to contact me. My email is dreamastrologer@yahoo.com.
Okay. And for those of you watching, I'm going to put all of that information for Gary down in the description box below so that you can get your own copy of Hermetica Triptycha, and also so that you can subscribe to Gary's podcast, because as you can see, Gary has a lot to share with us and we're all better for it. So
thank you, brother.
Thank you, Gary. And for our listeners and viewers out there, I just want to thank you all for sticking with the Oraculos True Divination podcast. It is truly a pleasure being able to connect with these phenomenal movers and shakers from within our field of astrology each and every week. And your comments and your feedback and everything that you've been saying, it means so much to me. So please do help us continue to share the magic and the momentum here by liking the YouTube channel, by subscribing to the YouTube channel, but also sharing these podcasts with your astrological family and friends so that more and more people can hear these interviews. Because what the world needs now is more amazing astrological interviews from more amazing astrologers from around the world. So, everyone, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for being here. I love you. Be well. Be safe and see you soon.
Here, here. Bye.
Whew. Gary.
Awesome, man.
Awesome. Thank you.